Hi there, this is Andy from Blessed Man Meditations. Recently, Alex O'Connor from Cosmic Skeptic posted a video containing about 40 arguments for atheism. I have no personal vindictive vendetta against Alex or against any other atheist. I love Alex, and I love all atheists as my fellow people, all created in God's image. But I believe their epistemology is wrong and needs to be responded to. This video will be part of a lengthy series I plan to do in response to each argument Alex makes. So please like this video, comment, and please subscribe. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.
A new, fast-growing Christian YouTube channel, Redeemed Zoomer, put out a video promisingly called All Atheist Arguments Answered in 10 Minutes. Let's see how he does.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer. Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than some random impersonal force.
Yeah, everybody knows that. Right? Sure, first cause arguments are powerful and interesting. I've already discussed them ad nauseum, but briefly, I suppose I'd agree that if they are successful in establishing a first cause, it wouldn't really make sense to ask what caused that cause. Giving it attributes of traditional theism, however, is of course a separate question.
In this video, we respond to the common question, if God made everything, then who or what made God? To review the video that Alex made, in response to the Redeemed Zoomer video. In the Redeemed Zoomer video, the atheist said, if God made everything, then who or what made God? The Christian in the Redeemed Zoomer video said God is the uncaused causer. He said there has to be a first cause for the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes more sense for it to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than for some random impersonal force to have caused everything. Alex says the first cause arguments are powerful and interesting. Alex agrees if they're successful in establishing a first cause, it wouldn't make sense to ask what caused that cause. Alex says giving the first cause attributes of traditional theism, though, is a separate question. In this response, I'm going to take responses from multiple Christian apologists to respond to Alex.
Then I've had a little boy come up to me on stage once, and I've had these sorts of questions. He said, Mr. Ham, well, who made God? So here's this 9-year-old boy. What do I say to a 9-year-old boy when he says, who made God? How do you answer that? Because you know what, Mum and Dad, I'm sure if you've had kids, you've had them ask that question. How do we answer that? Who made God? So I said to him, well, son, if somebody made God, you'd have to have a bigger God, right? Well, yes, sir. I said, now you got a problem. Yes, sir. Well, who made the bigger God? You'd have to have a bigger God that made the big God that made God, right? Yes, sir. Now you got a problem. Yes, sir. Who made the bigger God? You have to have a bigger God that made the bigger God that made the big God and made God, right? Yes, sir. Now you got a problem. I know. Because then you'd have to have a bigger God, made the bigger God, made the bigger God, made the big God, made God. And son, we can keep going back and getting a bigger God, but you know the only thing that makes logical sense, you have to have the biggest God of all. The infinite creator God. Infinite in wisdom, infinite in knowledge, outside of time, who created all things just like the Bible says. See, it's interesting. When I debated Bill Nye up here on that platform, at the end we had a question time, and one of the questions was written out by a 10-year-old boy. He said, where did matter come from? And so the moderator said, well, Bill Nye, how do you answer the question? Where did matter come from? He said, I don't know, it's a mystery. And then he said, Mr. Ham, how do you answer that question? I said, well, Bill, there is a book that tells us where matter came from, tells us who we are, what life is all about, what our problem is, what the solution is in Jesus Christ. And you see, here's the thing. If you think about it, atheists mock it up. You believe in an eternal God? How stupid. What do they believe in? Eternal matter? Energy? Eternal energy? Where did it come from? Where did the energy come from? Where did space come from? Where did anything come from? Why does anything exist? I mean, how do they explain that? You see, they have a blind faith but we have a faith that makes sense of what we see.
As Christians, we believe that God created the world. But as soon as you talk to a non-believer and say God created the world, there's a question that almost always comes up next. Well, then who created God? In fact, one of the great atheists of the 20th century, known as Bertrand Russell, he wrote a book called Why I Am Not a Christian. He said if the Christian says God made the world, then he has to be prepared to answer the question, who made God? So this question of who made God actually commits what we call a category fallacy. Before you freak out and think category fallacy, you've lost me. Here's an example. What if I asked you, how much does a musical note C weigh? You think, wait a minute, musical notes, which is sound and weight, these are distinct categories and you're confusing them. What does the color pink taste like? Wait a minute, color is something you see, that's a distinct category from taste. Well, asking who made God makes the same category fallacy. Why? We can only consistently ask who made something of things that can be made. So it makes sense to ask who made my shoes, because shoes are the kind of things that can be made. It makes sense to ask who made this camera, because cameras can be made. It makes sense to ask who made this building, because buildings can be made. But God, by definition, is the kind of thing that cannot be made. In fact, if God was made, then he wouldn't be God. So when somebody asks who made God, they're committing a category fallacy, because here's essentially what they're saying. Who made the unmakeable creator of the universe? That's like saying, what caused the uncaused, self-existent creator of the universe? Now here's what's most interesting about this. Up until the 20th century, Christians said God alone is self-existent and eternal. Atheists would say, no, the universe is self-existent and eternal. And scientifically, we couldn't really judge between the two. But in the 20th century, with a number of different scientific findings, now almost all scientists recognize that the universe had a beginning. And if it came into existence, then it certainly can't come from itself. It can't come from nothing. So there must be a cause outside of the universe to bring the universe into existence. And that's who the Bible describes as the everlasting God. So can I explain how there's a self-existent, uncaused creator of the universe? Of course I can, this side of heaven. Maybe even in heaven, we can't fully understand it. But here's what we know. We know that the world around us had a beginning, and that cries out for a self-existent cause outside of the universe, and it seems to best explain the world as we know it and we experience it.
Today, to help me address a very common question, is Dr. Hugh Ross. Welcome back, Hugh.
Thank you.
Now, I know that sometimes I go on atheist websites, but sometimes I also talk to children. I notice they have a question in common, and that is, if God made everything, then who made God? So walk us through this a little bit, because from a layperson's perspective, we're thinking, well, everywhere I look, things have a beginning, but God doesn't have a beginning, so how do I think about that?
Well, you're hitting the right question. It's the most frequent question I get in Facebook and Twitter.
Really?
Every atheist scientist I've ever debated publicly has raised that issue. Probably the most famous example is Louis Walpart, the debate I had at Imperial College. He was really eager to bring that question up because he thinks that is the Achilles heel
That's the
of
zinger.
the Christian faith. That's the zinger.
It's going to get you. All right.
It's going to get us. But I think you raised the point, is that there's a fallacy there. They're assuming that God is constrained in time like the universe is and all of life in the universe. And any entity that's constrained to a single dimension of time, where time can't be stopped or reversed, at some ultimate point must have a beginning or a creation event.
And that's where we are. We only have
That's where we are.
We only have access to one dimension of time.
Right.
As much as I would like to go back to my girls' childhoods, I can't do that.
Time goes forward.
Time goes forward.
We can slow it down, but you can't stop it or reverse it. So
then it's right to say everywhere I look, things have a beginning, but something is different about God. So help me think about that.
Once we understand that God created time, he's not subject to time, he's the author of time.
Okay.
And what I explained to Louis Walpart is it's physicists in Britain that developed the first of the space-time theorems, which established that time has a beginning, that time was created, implying there must be an agent outside of time that creates time. And this is the claim that the Bible makes repeatedly, that time is a beginning and that God was the one that created both space and time. And if God is not subject to linear time, then he need not have a beginning or an ending. Now, I think the way you can understand that, the Bible also claims in Psalm 90 that God can arbitrarily compress time and expand time. A day of the Lord is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. 1,000 years is like 3 hours in the night. And that's mathematically only possible for a being or an entity who can operate in at least the equivalent of 2 dimensions of time.
That Scripture says in a few different places that time has a beginning. Time was created.
Right.
Which makes us think that God is the one who created time, so he must stand outside of time.
Right.
Okay.
Just based on the fact that the Bible says God can arbitrarily compress or expand time in our time dimension. Mathematically, that minimally applies that God's got access to the equivalent of 2 dimensions of time. And we now have the physics that proves that time actually does have a beginning that is created. If you got 2 dimensions of time, you could have God operating on a timeline over here, infinitely long, that never crosses or touches the timeline of our universe over here. As such, he would have no beginning, no ending, and it would be uncreated. Now, of all the world's holy books, the Bible is the only one that says of God, no beginning, no ending, uncreated, the master of time, the author and the creator of time.
Well, so this makes me think that this could actually be a powerful piece of evidence for the reliability of the Bible, that it describes time having a beginning. It kind of predates the scientific discovery.
Yes, I mean, these statements were made thousands of years before physicists and astronomers actually proved that time has a beginning, that time is created, and there must be some causal agent beyond time.
Yes. If God created everything, then who created God? And if God created himself, then how did he create the mechanisms to create himself?
Right. On the argument that I give and on the standard theistic understanding of God, God is a metaphysically necessary being. That is to say, he exists beyond time and space, and therefore he doesn't have a cause. He is the first uncaused cause. Remember, the first premise of my argument was whatever begins to exist has a cause. Something cannot come into being without a cause. But it's impossible for a timeless, spaceless being to come into existence. So God simply exists in an uncreated way. He is eternal, he's timeless and uncaused. Now, lest you think this is special pleading for God, I'd remind you that this is what the atheist has always said about the universe, that the universe is eternal and therefore uncaused. Matter and energy are eternal and never caused. But that's now become highly implausible in light of astrophysical cosmology. It points to a transcendent cause beyond the universe, which is eternal, timeless, and therefore uncreated.
Okay, who made God, in other words, right? If you're going to say the universe had a beginning, then God must have had a beginning. That's a good question. Here's the problem. Nobody created God because God is uncreated. There has to be something that wasn't created, that's eternal, that brought everything else into existence. You say, why God? Why not something else? Well, think about it this way. Remember we talked about the cosmological argument? That space, matter, and time had a beginning, or space, time, and matter had a beginning. And we said that if space, time, and matter had to have a beginning, whatever created space, time, and matter can't be made of space, time, and matter. You remember we talked about this? Okay, so the cause must be spaceless, timeless, right? If you're timeless, do you have a beginning? No. See, God is timeless. He's outside of time, so he didn't have a beginning. Everything inside of time has a beginning, but something outside of time doesn't have a beginning.
Discussion. I want to address the who designed the designer question, because it's the old schoolboy question, who created God? I'm actually very surprised to find it as a central argument in your book, because it assumes that God is created. And I'm not surprised, therefore, that you call the book The God Delusion, because created gods are by definition a delusion. Now, I know, and I ought to explain, that Richard doesn't like people who say to him that they don't believe in the God he doesn't believe in. But I think that this is possibly touching a sore spot, because you leave yourself wide open to the charge. After all, you are arguing that God is a delusion. And in order to weigh your argument, I said that it is you who's arguing that God is a delusion.
Oh, sorry. All right.
And in order to weigh that argument, I need to know what you mean by God. And if you say, if there is a God, you have to ask who created God, that means that you're reduced to thinking about created gods. Well, none of us believe in created gods, Jews, Muslims, or Christians. And I think that argument then is entirely beside the point, and perhaps you ought to put it on your shelf marked celestial teapots where it belongs. The God who created the universe, ladies and gentlemen, was not created. He is eternal. This is the fundamental distinction between God and the universe. It came to exist, he did not. And this is precisely the point the Christian apostle John makes at the beginning of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word. The Word already was. All things came to be by him. God is uncreated. The universe was created by him. Now, I don't know whether Richard has difficulty with the concept of the uncreated. I don't know, and I'd love to know whether he believes as a materialist that matter and energy and the laws of nature were always there, because if they were, he does believe in something eternal. So perhaps the difficulty lies in believing in an eternal person.
There is an argument used against the existence of God that is by far the worst objection I've ever heard. You won't find it used among professional philosophers, but instead, I tend to encounter it in great amounts online among laymen. When theists argue from cosmological or contingency arguments that God created the universe, the worst reply a skeptic can make is,
who created God?
What created God?
If God did indeed have a beginning, by the simple logic of cause and effect, there had to be an agent, separate and apart from the effect, that caused it.
So then I want to know where God came from.
Who created God? Who created the person who created God? Who created the person who created the person who created God?
Design is dead, otherwise one must explain who designed the designer.
Who created this God?
This, in my opinion, is by far the worst objection ever made by a skeptic. And I don't even need to appeal to theistic philosophers to point this out. I can refer to atheist philosophers like Michael Ruse, who highly agrees. Now, for those who may be wondering why this is such a bad objection, the basic reasoning is there is no thought put into it. Just because we can argue the universe was created, that doesn't mean we imply that everything needs a creator to exist. How the skeptic can make this leap is beyond me. No theist argues everything needs a creator. Look at the very simple Kalam cosmological argument. The first premise is not everything has a cause, but that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Obviously, we're not implying everything has a creator, but only things that have a beginning. My favorite cosmological argument, the Leibnizian version, makes this distinction very clear. Anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external explanation. So again, just because some things like the universe have an external cause, that doesn't mean everything that exists must also have a cause. God would be by definition of the first category, a being who doesn't need an external cause and is necessary. Because of this, asking who created God is equivalent to asking what caused an uncaused thing. It simply is nonsensical. Basically, cosmological arguments have pointed out for centuries that since contingent things exist, like us, our existence can only be explained by appealing to external causes. However, this cannot go on infinitely. There has to be a first cause, an unmoved mover, which started this chain. Whatever this is, it would be necessary, not needing to be created, which is who we theists would then call God. So when theists argue the universe has a cause or an explanation, we are saying this infers a substance or a being that would be the first cause and is uncreated and necessary, which we theists then argue would be who we call God. This is not special pleading since the first mover would be uncaused by definition, and defined differently than contingent things, like the universe. Look at it this way. The atheist philosopher David Hume said the universe was necessary. If you would have gone to David Hume and tried to refute his theory the universe was uncaused by asking if the universe is the explanation of our existence, then what created the universe, he would have simply replied he stated the universe is necessary, and therefore didn't need a creator. Now I bring this up because when I've tried to point this out to skeptics in the past, they commonly reply by saying, if God doesn't need a creator, then why does the universe? Why can't we just say the universe is necessary? Well, this was a prevalent belief of atheists before the 20th century, but the observable data in cosmology and physics has strongly refuted this possibility. An overwhelming amount of evidence now shows our space-time is contingent and had a beginning, so it cannot be necessary in and of itself. Now, of course, we can have a conversation over what is the most likely cause of the universe, and I've argued the theistic case in more detail elsewhere. But the basic point is simply asking who created God is a ridiculous objection, and I don't even need to appeal to theistic philosophers to point this out. I'll leave you with the words of the atheist philosopher Michael Ruse, who responded to Richard Dawkins when he tried this objection.
Yeah, philosophy 100 undergraduate response, what caused God? You know, we've all done it. We've all been there. And, you know, I mean, it's a good question, but, you know, it's not the end of the argument. Dawkins then triumphantly says, there you are, bad argument, let's move on. You know, and I know, that Christians, St. Augustine, certainly St. Thomas, spent a hell of a lot of, I mean, they knew this. And so what they were trying to do was articulate a notion of God who would be first cause. You know, the whole notion of aseity, God as a necessary being, God, God's essence is his existence. The point is, Christians have got some grown-up responses to these sorts of things. And I think that Dawkins does a serious misservice to the cause of non-belief by not being prepared to take seriously the kinds of things that believers believe in.
So we've seen multiple Christian theologians respond to this objection, and we've seen that this objection is wanting and is not a very good objection to why theism or Christian theism must not be true and why atheism must be true. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.